Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. As we've been talking about over and over and over again, the coronavirus has introduced stress into all of our lives in one way or another. Some of us because of jobs, some of us because of economics. It goes on and on. And part of the problem is the unknown. We just don't know when it's going to end. But stress is stress, and we all handle it in different ways. And it affects us, it affects our families. It's never a good thing. And not long ago on The Big Picture, we interviewed Danny Neverth Jr., who is the coordinator for Erie County Emergency Services. And he recommended that we address the subject of first responders, the stress that they are dealing with, especially now under the circumstances that we're going through. But not just now, on an everyday level where they just see things and they deal with things that the rest of the population in their jobs don't normally have to deal with. And so we decided to get in contact with Bonita Frazer and Officer Tony LeBron. They are with the Western New York Law Enforcement Helpline. Okay, Bonita is the president of that association, and I want to welcome them to the show. Bonita and Tony, welcome to the show. Let's have a discussion about the stress that first responders deal with on a regular basis just because of the nature of the job. Welcome to the show. Tell me a little bit. Now, this may sound like an obvious question, but why are first responders any more subject to PTSD and stress than any other job that somebody might go to? I mean, don't we all have pressures when we go to work every day?
Absolutely. However, there is a level of stress that is much higher in emergency services because unfortunately, they have to see the worst of the worst on a regular basis. They're often scrutinized in the media. They are working 24/7. They are often away from their families. They often have to take on overtime. There are just a number of issues that are present within emergency services that ramp up the level of stress for them at a very significant level. And I think Tony could probably speak to that much more effectively than I can at this point.
Sure, like Bonnie said, officers, unfortunately, they don't get to see the people at the best of times. They normally see people at the worst of times. Police One did a study a year and a half ago regarding incidents of trauma that an officer witnesses in a year. And they figured out that approximately 188 incidents of trauma is what an average officer witnesses per calendar year. So over a 20-year career, you're talking more than 3,700 incidents of trauma, motor vehicle accidents, suicides, homicides, child abuse. It just goes on and on. More than the normal human being should have to be witness to in a lifetime, let alone in a short amount of time.
I've worked with many police officers over the years, both here and in Los Angeles, and in covering the news, I've seen a lot of the things that they've seen and dealt with a lot of the situations that they have to deal with. And I know that there are things that the general population doesn't normally experience. And it's hard to explain to people the real world out there is a tough place. It's bad things happen to people. And unless you are out there and experience that, it's very, very tough to get people to understand what happens because most of the population is shielded from that. And Tony, you've seen things as a police officer. Bonita, you've seen things or heard about things that officers have gone through and stories that they've told. Tony, how does it feel when you have to deal with that side of life, and then on top of it, people view police officers now in a light that you're not there to help people, but you may be viewed as an enemy, or you may be viewed as a nuisance, or somebody that's not a positive thing. I mean, years ago, police officers were looked on differently. They were looked on as a friendly presence in society, and now, the press and videos, phone videos and stuff. There's a lot of confusion as to how police officers do their job, and it's not easy to explain things to the general public sometimes.
One of the things that the general public always needs to remember is that even though it's a police officer, it's still just a human being. They make mistakes. Things happen. An officer receives a ton of training, but even still, an officer could never be trained enough for what you're going to deal with on the street on a daily basis. And you're right. The times have definitely changed. Officers now wear body cameras, which is a good thing. The officers have the ability to rewind and show exactly what did occur at the scene. They are scrutinized much more now than ever before. Everything is instantaneous. Like you said, everyone has a cell phone. About 25 seconds after an incident is over with, it's uploaded to YouTube or it's being streamed Facebook Live. So it definitely is a different way of doing policing in today's day and age than it was. I came on in 1989. So it was definitely a different time back then. Policing was done differently than it is now.
Yeah, and people, yeah, there used to be a certain respect for law enforcement, and now I think because of the way you see police officers on camera and the way the press has been reporting certain stories, the respect is not there, and people tend to be a little more brazen. I mean, you see police officers attacked. You see in New York City people, dousing police officers in the performance of their duty with water and people throwing things at them. That would have never happened years ago. When we were growing up, police officers were respected, and you wouldn't want to mess with police officers. That would have been a no-no.
It's definitely different. I think it's not just related solely to law enforcement, though. If you look at it really society as a whole, the level of respect for other individuals has definitely declined over the years. 25 years ago, who would have ever thought you might have had a road rage incident? Nowadays, it becomes all too common, where people they just don't have the respect that they did years ago. And it comes magnified, obviously, under the microscope for law enforcement, though. You are correct, which is another added stressor.
Bonita, what are the signs that somebody is under such pressure that they're undergoing this trauma and that they need a little bit of help?
Right. Oh, there's multiple signs. Usually the signs of stress show up in one of 5 categories. They might notice some behavioral changes in themselves, all right, or you might notice it in the individual. There might be some emotional changes. In other words, their moods might be somewhat erratic or maybe not appropriate to the situation, or you see excessive sadness or excessive anger. You might see changes cognitively. In other words, the way they're thinking. Their thinking might be disrupted a little bit. Things like concentration, reason, memory, problem solving. They might notice physical changes in themselves. So that's where they get the headaches, the gastrointestinal upset, backaches, different types of body aches and pains. Certainly lack of sleep is huge. And last but not least, there might be some spiritual changes where people actually have that crisis of faith. So one of the things that we try to do is train police officers not only to recognize those changes in themselves, but to recognize them in their fellow officers so that immediate action can be taken on behalf of that individual. So like with any medical issue, the sooner it's addressed, right, the better the prognosis. Well, it's the same from a psychological standpoint as well. We want to make sure that these things are addressed as soon as they start to come to the surface so that we can kind of stop it as quickly as possible and get that officer back to business. And the other thing too is, I know we're talking about officers, but I also just want to say this is true for fire and EMS and dispatch, and certainly the wide range of medical personnel and ancillary staff that are experiencing all of this in the hospital settings as well. If
there is a set standard for helping the first responders, is it something that they need to reach out to get help, or is it something that family members see kind of warning signs and can ask for help? How does this, how does this happen? Tony, are there police officers that have a tendency to be in denial and not want to get involved with this because they're afraid it's going to affect their career?
Well, sure, because when you become a police officer, you get that S on your chest, and right away you're Superman or you're Superwoman. But unfortunately, technology has created a bulletproof vest. When you go out there every day, you wear your vest because it protects your vital organs. God forbid you get shot at. but science still has not come up with anything to protect the officer's mind or their eyes for what they see on a daily basis, which is why we've had the Western New York Helpline in existence now for over 8 years. And it's basically a 24-hour crisis services for law enforcement. We assist by, when they call in, they get spoken to by a trained peer. And we also have a family component where a family member can call in if they're having some stress issues and speak to another family member of law enforcement that has also been received specialized training in order to handle those type of calls.
So, and if a family member calls in and says, my husband or my wife is on the job and, they seem to be stressed out and it's becoming more and more of a problem, how do you approach a responder when they haven't themselves admitted or called in? How does that take effect? I mean, if they're in denial, for instance, and they say, no, I don't have a problem.
Unfortunately, the stigma that's associated with asking for and receiving any kind of mental health support, psychological support, whatever you want to call it, continues to grow. And we're trying to chip away at that because there's this belief that if you ask for help or you need help, then that somehow represents a character flaw or some level of weakness. That's certainly not the case. These are human beings. And the truth is that it is an absolute fact that there is a direct correlation between the level of dose exposure. In other words, the number of exposures that somebody has to these various events that Tony had already talked about, and a subsequent onset of adult mental health disorders, with PTSD, of course, being the most common. And it's estimated that up to 24% of law enforcement officers do, in fact, have PTSD. I mean, they have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of divorce. And this is not because there's some genetic predisposition for those types of issues to arise. It's because of the ongoing day-to-day stress that they experience that has a way of just eroding whatever resiliency that's there for them. So in terms of trying to address it, yes, we train them right at the academy level, and we provide ongoing training about recognizing these signs in yourself, knowing that asking for help isn't a weakness, and we really push that point home. But in addition to that, we are trying to constantly market the helpline, make sure that folks understand that it's available, and try to educate the family members as well, and help people to recognize that this is not some kind of weakness in you. This is just the way it is. And we talk about the physiology of what happens to the body when it is exposed to some kind of trauma, and how this is not a weakness. This is a physiological reaction that accounts for those stress symptoms that they're experiencing. You also asked a little bit about how do we help people. When people are in denial, I usually will be relatively upfront and honest with them and let them know, okay, but you've told me that you're not sleeping. You've told me that you're, snapping at your family. So when you're ready for those things to stop, when you're ready for those things to calm down, you can let me know, because that's when the real work is going to start. That's when we can begin to, put some measures into place that are going to dampen down, whatever that anxiety is that you're experiencing. And sometimes after several episodes of reaching out, that's a lot of times when people will finally go ahead and grab onto that lifeline and take advantage of the service that's being offered. It doesn't necessarily happen the first time you offer it. It might mean you have to go back several times.
Okay. And just to be sure, Tony, if somebody does need help and they seek help, or if their family says that they need help, it's not going to be a reflection on their job security or their status of their job, whether police or fire or any other kind of first responder?
No, the bedrock of what we do with the helpline is predicated on confidentiality. That is first and foremost. If an individual comes to us or a family member comes to us regarding a officer or someone in need of assistance, that remains with that individual peer who receives that call or who is working together with them. Nothing gets reported back to the department. It does not get reported back to the union. We do have trained clinicians that we have vetted that have agreed to see an officer in need within a 72-hour period. So if it gets to that level, we will get them in with someone, a professional, as quickly as we possibly can to get them the help that they need and get them onto the road to recovery.
Now,
Again, with everything being confidential.
that's all the time we have on this segment. We're still under a lot of stress, and we'll be right back with our conversation with Tony LeBron and Bonita Frazer right after this.